sometimes we can get so caught up with what we're doing for Christ that we fail to understand that if we're not careful, we can be brought down. We can be humbled, and it's a very painful thing sometimes to be humbled when you think you're doing so much for Christ. Our scripture passage for tonight is found in Matthew 26 and verse 41. This is Jesus talking to his disciples as Jesus is in the garden praying. And this is what Jesus says to his disciples: watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. If you've ever looked for a job, or if you've ever sent an application in for a job, or you've ever been waiting to be interviewed for a job, then you know how frustrating that process can be. You look in the paper, you look in the classified section, Craigslist, wherever you look for jobs, and you find a job, and you think, well, this is the perfect job for me. This is the one that I need. This is the one that matches all my qualifications. I went to school for this. I have all the things they need to match up with that job, so I'm looking forward to that. And as you send in that application, you know for a fact that you're going to get the job. You're going to at least be interviewed for the job. And then, before long, much to your disappointment and surprise, you get an email or you get a letter, and basically saying, we appreciate your interest. You're a very qualified person, but we are going in a different direction. We have chosen to talk with someone else. It's hard to believe, but there was someone more qualified than you for that job. Well, tonight we continue looking at our study, 10 Men from the Bible, and the person we're looking at tonight is a man named David. We know a lot about David. We've talked a lot about David in previous Sunday night worship experiences. We've talked about who he is and what he did. But, you know, there's more to David than what we know about. You know, we know David as this young shepherd boy who one day was told by his father to take food and water to his brothers who were fighting a battle. They were on the front lines of the battle, and his father told him, said, take this to your brothers, check on them, see how they're doing. Well, David does this. He takes the food and he goes to the front line where his brothers are waiting there. And while he's there just taking food, as his father said do, we know that Goliath comes out. Now, Goliath was this huge giant Philistine, and he comes out, and basically Goliath has spent a whole lot of time ridiculing the Israelites, making fun of them, mocking them, because no one can beat Goliath, no one can defeat Goliath. And Goliath just comes out day after day, and he's ridiculing them and mocking them, making fun of them. And so as David is bringing this food, as David is looking to see how his brothers are doing, David overhears Goliath come out and ridicule the Israelites and mock the Israelites. But not only that, David hears something else that really just is kind of beyond what he can take, and that is, he hears Goliath mock God, his God, David's God. And so David gets really, really upset, and David decides on his own that he is going to fight Goliath. Well, we know the story of how David was actually not even fit for that job. I mean, really, you look at somebody that's going to fight a giant, you're not going to look for some young shepherd boy. You're not going to look for someone who's really had no fighting experience. You know, if you look at jobs today and people are looking for candidates, they want to have some experience. You know, so if David was going to be fighting Goliath, you would think the headline would read, you know, or or job application would read, you know, some experience fighting giants preferred. David had none of that. He did fight off wild animals as being a shepherd, but he never fought a giant before. So David took a break from his job as a shepherd to fight Goliath, to not only fight Goliath, but to defeat Goliath by gathering stones from a river. And he walked up to Goliath. He was never intimidated by Goliath or by the size of Goliath, because he knew God would take care of him. And you know, sometimes we're in the situation David's in. We look at our lives and we look at what's going on around us, maybe to us, maybe with our family or friends, and we look at that as kind of a Goliath in our life or a giant in our lives, and we wonder, how in the world am I going to defeat this giant in my life? How in the world are things going to work out good for me with what's going on? Now, I want to encourage you tonight to understand that sometimes when the giants look big to us, they look small to God. And so what we need to do is keep our eyes on God and let Him fight our battles for us. And that's probably the story we all know, the famous story we all know of David and Goliath. Is how he beat Goliath and took him down. And David was praised for being a great fighter, a great warrior, and did so many good things. But you know, there's more to that than David. There's more to that when we look at this passage of Scripture that says we need to be careful and we need to make sure that we're on the lookout so that we don't fall into temptation. Because even though our spirit is willing, our flesh is weak. Jesus was talking to His disciples when He said that they were tired, and He knew that they were weak and they may fall into Satan's temptation. But you know, each and every one of us are human. Each and every one of us have a weakness in our lives. And we too have to be careful. We have to be very careful that we continue to follow God and keep our strength and our eyes on God. There was a time in David's life after he defeated Goliath when he was at a crossroads in his life. If you've ever had someone become jealous of you, you know where David was at. You wouldn't have thought this would have happened to David because King Saul loved David. He appreciated David. He thought a lot of David, so much that he called on David quite a bit. When Saul was having a bad day, he would call on David to come and play music for him because he knew this music made him feel better. And so he would call on David. He appreciated David. He knew that David had things, skills that he needed in his life. And so Saul would call on David to come and kind of, soothe his soul with the music and things like this. And David was highly appreciated and respected. That is until that one day when they were out in the streets and the people began to dance and the people began to sing and say that David has slain his 10,000s and Saul has only slain his thousands. And it was at that point when something happened in the life of Saul and jealousy creeped in. Jealousy that caused Saul to not see David as the person he saw him as before. And Saul began to be so jealous of David that he tried to kill David. He tried to take David's life. Not once, twice, or 3 times, but 6 times Saul tried to kill David. After the 6th time, David said, well, obviously, I think Saul wants me dead. I mean, 6 times somebody tries to kill you with spears and everything else. I guess they do. So David runs and he tries to escape Saul. David does different things to try to get away from Saul as Saul is chasing him. And one of the things David does, and we may not know this about David, but one of the things that David did was David retreated to a place called Gath. And what he did there was David pretended to be a madman, complete with acting crazy, acting wild, going crazy. He did that until the king of Gath told him, you can't be here anymore. You got to leave. Now, I didn't know that David actually had that part of his life where he tried to be a madman just to get away from Saul, because he needed the king of Gath, he needed them to let him stay there. And so he was hoping they would allow him to stay there, but the madman impersonation was too much, and they told him he had to leave. So David left Gath, and we're told that David went and kept running and tried to do things his own way. Now, I don't know what you're going through tonight, but I would encourage you not to do it your own way. I would encourage you to allow God to lead you, God to guide you, God to give you wisdom on how to handle things. You see, as humans, a lot of times we want to do things our own way. Because as humans, we feel like we've got the answers to our lives. You know, we appreciate God's help. We appreciate what God can do for us. We appreciate that God is there for us, but really, we don't need Him because we've got everything taken care of. And this is much the way David had thought. And think about it. David killed Goliath. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that could have happened. He took down basically the undefeated. And so sometimes when that happens, when you take down a person who has never been beaten before, you think in your life, you think in your own mind, there's nothing that can happen to me because look at what I've done. Much as on the video. Look at what I've done. But you know, sometimes we have to be careful. As Jesus told His disciples, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And if we're not careful, we will be brought down by the things of the world. And so David decides he's going to do things on his own, so he tries to be a madman. He also runs and keeps running until he comes to this cave. Now there's a cave that he goes into, and it's in that cave that David decides, if I'm ever going to get out of this, I'm going to have to do it with God. I can't do it on my own anymore. I've tried, I've run, I've tried to be different people, I've tried to be somebody I'm not, and I just can't do it anymore. And I need to get back with God, because you see, before all of this happened, when David was a shepherd boy, that's when he was closest to God. When God called him and anointed him to be king. When David went and fought Goliath. He was so close to God. He was a man after God's own heart, and that's when good things were happening to him and God was blessing him. And then when he decided to go out on his own, things started going kind of weird in his life and chaotic in his life. And he had to go back to that cave, and while in that cave he sat and he focused and he brought that relationship with God back to where it needed to be. Here's another challenge for tonight. No matter what you're going through in life, if things aren't going the way you want them to go, if you feel like you've kind of gone as far as you can go with this problem, this issue in life, I encourage you to find your own cave with God. And what I mean by that is simply this. There must be a time in the Christian's life when we decide it's time for me to get along with God and make sure God is where He needs to be in my life. Because something happens as humans when we get in predicaments and situations that are tough, is we tend to focus on everything and everybody around us instead of keeping God where He needs to be. God needs to be first in our life, and He was for David up until that point. And as David ran, David realized the more I run, the farther I'm getting away from God. So I've got to get back to being right there with God and putting God first place in my life. So we're told in the Scripture that David goes into a cave and he begins to focus on God. And he brings God back to where God needs to be in his life. And David gets to a point where he's feeling good once again about his relationship with God. David is happy where he is with God. He's beginning to grow again. And just when things were settling down and David was focusing on God, the way he did when he was a shepherd or when he fought Goliath, we know what happens. Something else comes along that causes him to struggle. We know that happens to us as well. Things go well, and then when things are going well, I always tell people, when things are going really well, get ready. Because that's when Satan wants to throw bad things at you. That's when Satan brings something else into your life. And if we can always keep in our mind the thought, no matter what happens today, God, I want to keep you first in my life, then maybe that'll help us. But we have to be ready for that. You know, I'm not saying live out of fear every day, but what I'm saying is live in God's sight every day. Make sure that we are keeping our focus on God, because when things are going good, that's when Satan wants to bring something else into our lives to bring us down, and that's what happened with David. Things were going good for David when this messenger comes up. Now, one of the things David knew was that King Saul and King Saul's son Jonathan was David's best friend. He kind of saved David's life when Saul was trying to kill him. He knew that King Saul and Jonathan were fighting a battle. And so David was kind of waiting on messages to see how things were going. And this messenger, Amalekite, comes, and he's dirty, he's torn his clothes, which is a sign back then of mourning. And so he comes up to David and he brings David this message. King Saul and Jonathan are killed. They're dead. Now you look at that and you think, well, David should be happy about the fact that Saul is no longer alive. He was trying to kill him. But the thing about David was this. While David did not like Saul trying to kill him, one thing David knew was this. King Saul was still king by God's choosing. And so if he's God's man, I still have to respect him. I may not appreciate the fact that he tried to throw a spear through me, but I do respect him. And so David knew that his king had died. But more importantly, David knew his best friend, Jonathan, had died. We've probably been in a situation where David is right now in his life. It's a very cold place when we're sitting in a place and maybe in a waiting room or a hospital, and the doctor comes in and says, you know, we've basically done all we can do. You know, I've seen it a lot in the hospital when the doctor comes in and the doctor will call me as a chaplain and say, hey chaplain, I need you to go to a room with me and I know what's coming. Man, I know what's coming when a doctor wants me to go in the room with them. And when I walk in a room with a doctor, the family knows what's happening too. And it's a cold, cold place when a doctor looks at a family and says, I'm sorry, but there's nothing else we could have done. And then there's that silence. And you know, when this messenger, this Amalekite, came and handed David Saul's crown and also a bracelet that Saul had been wearing, David knew beyond any doubt that his king and his best friend had just died. And when that happened, David had another crossroad he had to face. Once again, he had to pull himself up, pull himself together, because once again, Satan had brought something into his life to try to throw him off course with God. David began to mourn. David called his nation to mourn. And there's nothing wrong with mourning, as we're told as in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is a time for crying and for mourning. And David knew that this was a time for mourning. And so he called the nation to mourning because the king had died. But David knew something else. Just as there's a time for mourning, there's also a time for moving on. And so David began to move on. And now David, after King Saul died, David knew his time to be king was now. And so David began doing great things as a king. He brought the nation back together. The nation had been divided. And he brought them back together. Did some really great things. And David started his kingship in a great way, following God and doing what God would have him to do. And David was well respected. His soldiers respected him and followed him. There was nobody in the land that didn't love and appreciate David. David was very high up. And David was doing great. Everything was good for David. David was so high up on the mountain. David was so happy. Remember what I said a while ago? When things are going good, you have to look out. Because that's when Satan will throw something in. Sure enough, just as David was on the mountaintop as a king, something happens. It was the springtime and it was warm when David began to look out his window. And he saw on the rooftop a lady by the name of Bathsheba. She was sunbathing, and David saw that she was beautiful. And so David told his servant, he said, I want you to go and find out about this lady. Well, the servant came back and he told David two things that should have been red flags for David. The first thing he said was, this lady is named Bathsheba and she's married. Talk about a red flag. That should have been a huge warning. David, Bathsheba is married. You don't need to deal with this, David. She's married. But the second thing he said to him was this. Not only is she married, but she's married to Uriah. Now, David, you probably know Uriah. Uriah is one of the soldiers in the army, David. Not only is she married, she's married to somebody you know. And I believe the messenger or the servant was telling David this for a reason. David, I want you to know she's married. I want you to know her husband, because you need to stay away from this. This was God's way of warning David to stay away. But you remember what the scripture says. Your spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so David, even in the midst of those two warnings, didn't hear what the servant was saying. Didn't catch on to what the servant was saying. And so David said, I want somebody to bring Bathsheba to me. If you know the story, you know that she came. And later on, David found out that she was expecting his child. And so David, when he found this out, instead of trying to make things right, he tried to cover it up. He called in Uriah and tried to get Uriah killed and have him killed so that he wouldn't find out about this, so the husband wouldn't find out about it. Once again, David decided, I'm going to do things on my own. You see, Satan has a way of confusing us when things seem to be going good for us, if we don't keep our eyes focused on God. Satan has a way of making us think so high of ourselves and so much of ourselves that we forget that who we are is basically because of God. You know, one of the things about Pastor Appreciation Day I love is hearing how much people appreciate me. One of the hardest parts of Pastor Appreciation Day is hearing how much people appreciate about me. Because as humans, you hear that, and if you're not careful, I'll be on a mountain like David and think, you know what? Man, I'm a good pastor. Man, I'm a good preacher. That's why I'm thankful for my family. That can help me balance that out. And understand that whatever we do, I mean, Scott's a great Gideon, and I'm sure he was a great wildlife officer and things like that. But I can guarantee you, because I know Scott, if you ask him, everything he was able to do, he gives God credit for. Gideons give God credit for what they do. Missionaries give God credit. Why? Because if we are not careful as humans, when we do things, we will lift ourselves up, because Satan will begin to help us do that. And Satan will say, look what you can do. You're doing great things. And boy, you know, look at all these people. They're not doing what they need to do, but you're doing great things. And you should just be proud of yourself. And Jesus says, be careful. For the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. David has shown us in his life that we can do great things with God's help. But David has also shown us in his life that if we don't keep our eyes focused on God who gives us that strength, we can be brought down as well. And we can make mistakes. And we can do things that we are not proud of. Mainly because we decide to do things on our own. So tonight, as we conclude David, I want to kind of wrap this up by simply saying this. As Jesus told his disciples, I share with you as well. In life, be careful. Keep your eyes focused on Christ. Because no matter how strong we feel we are as Christians, we're still humans. And we need to understand that we can make mistakes if we take our eyes off Christ. God will forgive us. God still loves us. But He wants us to know He can help us and keep us from making those mistakes. Would you pray with me?